so much for coming. I'm going to start with this. It's a book that I was listening to on the way here. It's from the very short introduction series of books by Oxford University Press. This one is on the Harlem Renaissance by Cheryl A. Wall, a scholar who is very great. She had happened to her, I'm guessing what happened to me in one of the book chapters I had published, where like I had a book page that was wrong, and I'm like, that book doesn't even go that high. That's not right. So editors sometimes miss things. An editor missed something in this book about Aaron Douglas. They actually said that he was born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the academic in me, as I'm driving along, not quite the minute I got here, I got on my phone and put a note to myself going, nope. He was born in Topeka, Kansas, and he went to school in Lincoln, and so, yeah. But these things happen when you get published, so you just have to kind of grin and bear it. So if you get this book, do me a favor, and just either in hard copy or a Kindle, just write out, no, he was born in Topeka, Kansas, and raised in Topeka, and then he went to Lincoln for undergrad. Anyway, so with that, just to let you know what kind of nitpicker I am, thank you so much for having me here. I will be talking today about Aaron Douglas, William Artis, and the Harlem Renaissance. As you can hopefully see, and maybe I'll do it this way. As you can see, this piece of art, and maybe you can even catch his signature, is by Aaron Douglas. And then this is by, the sculpture, portrait head is by William Artis. Both of them have a lot of commonalities, and even if they might vary a teeny bit, which I'll be talking about through the talk and showing you, I would like to say that I uploaded this just a few minutes ago. I'd never had before, so I'm pretty excited. Tech doesn't always work for me, so I have this. Yeah. So if you have a question, feel free to ask. I am a lot of things, and sometimes, where I carry a little notepad with me, so if a question comes to mind and you're like, I don't want to interrupt her, but I really want to know X, or I wonder if she knows X, just get my attention and say, excuse me, but could you let me know, or whatever, because if I don't ask it and I don't write it down, it is gone. My friend says she doesn't want things in her brain space. I'm like, my brain has no space. It's just like, oh, it's not staying. So if you would like to know something, I'm not saying I'm going to know. I'll do my best to either find out if I don't know. But yeah, sometimes things just pop in your head. They pop in mine. And but if you're more disciplined than I, maybe you can wait till the end. There'll be question and answer time at the end. But if something comes up during, I am okay. I will not go, I'm talking. So with that, let's get started, shall we? As I said, we will be talking about these two artists that have work in the collection of the Museum of Nebraska Art. And by the way, yes, these pieces are in the collection, so you can see them when they're on exhibit. Are they on exhibit now? Yay! Even better. Awesome sauce. So I will be talking about Aaron Douglas, born in Topeka, Kansas, in 1899, and he lived till 1979. This is a painting of his, untitled, seated man with hand on, I think, or just seated with face on hand, I think. And then here's a portrait, Vernon is this portrait sculpture by William Artis, born 1914, and then lived till 1977. So what I'd like to do is first talk about what occurred before the Harlem Renaissance, and then tell you about the Harlem Renaissance, and then kind of break down what these two artists did with their work. So first and foremost, before the Renaissance was the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And this was to reconstruct the country. For some people, they wanted to reconstruct it as a biracial, it leaves out folks, a biracial democracy. For others, it was, how do we keep going what we had going? So even though there were laws passed to give folks the right to vote, give folks freedom, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, unfortunately, had little asterisks by them. So the 13th Amendment was freedom. It was basically it was saying people are free unless, and then they put in a little asterisk clause about convict labor. And honestly, that was slavery by another name, as I'll quote an author's text on that. The 14th Amendment was about equal protection of the law, but then the little asterisk there was, unless you were not told things, if you were arrested unjustly, if you were arrested under what were called Negro laws versus white laws, or crimes rather, Negro crimes like vagrancy or stealing versus murder, that's when you could be convicted and then put back in a labor system that was slavery by another name. The 15th Amendment was the right to vote. If you were, first of all, male, it wasn't universal suffrage, it was just voting for men. And if you could even find out where the voting was taking place, because there were things like white primaries, they were called, where they would they would hold a primary and not tell people where it would be if you were black. They would have grandfather clauses, poll taxes. There were, unfortunately, a lot of ways that folks who wanted to maintain the status quo of enslavement, they wanted to keep that system in place. They did not want it to be, people to have their freedom. And that was even more problematic because there were millions of black people in this country at the time, at the end of the Civil War, who had never been enslaved, who were always free. But there were laws that were passed, or Supreme Court decisions like Plessy v. Ferguson, that basically, in a sense, kind of made it kind of gave second-class citizenship to certainly formerly enslaved blacks, but also those who had been never enslaved. It wasn't overturned until Plessy v. Ferguson said it was separate but equal was fine. It was overturned in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, that said separate is inherently unequal. So, and then they had to do Brown 2 in 1955 that said you've got to do this with deliberate speed. Any wordsmiths in here know that deliberate and speed don't go together, okay? As a speeder, I'll tell you that. I often can be like, I was challenged a bit on the drive here going, so anyway, yeah, how many times can you do traffic school? So, but Reconstruction, it had laws that were not really they really weren't let me back up. Who here, as I have already confessed, and yes, it's recorded, and sure, we're going to turn you in, but who here has ever driven faster than the speed limit? I don't even know what you're doing. Are there times where you never drive faster than the speed limit? Such as? There's police around. There's somebody sick. You are late for work. Isn't that valid? You are. But if there's an enforcing authority, you're only going to do it if you don't have what my phone told me this morning, which is speed, blah, blah, ahead. So anyway, you're not going to speed because there's someone to enforce the law. But all of you have just admitted to breaking the law. And so, we can get very narrow-minded or binary about laws where it's right or it's wrong, or I'm a good person, I'm not a lawbreaker, or I am. I'm like, well, you're probably breaking a lot of laws, but if you're not caught, did you break it? It's not really supposed to be some mythical, like, if the tree falls in the forest, but kinda, so if you speed and you're not caught, you're still a speeder, you're still breaking the law. But if there's no one there to enforce that law basically doesn't exist in that moment. That is so much what happened with these the amendments that came, the Reconstruction amendments, where folks were promised something, but then not really followed through because they weren't enforced. It's played up, or it's commented on by Martin Luther King Jr. in his March on Washington speech, where he said, black people were written a check that came back insufficient funds. You're promised something, but you're not given it. It's not enforced that you have freedom to vote and freedom to be free even, And so these are things that the country was really struggling with. It certainly wasn't an absolute, just like, we are a very multi-varied country that has people of many views, et cetera. So suffice to say, in that time, there were folks that got put into situations, again, slavery by another name. Also, there was what a colleague of mine came up with years ago, and I suppose I should be better and put a citation, but I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, the post-emancipation Hydra. Who here is familiar with Greek mythology and knows what a Hydra is? Yes. Sir, did you have your hand? Do you know what a Hydra is? Exactly. And what's so this corner in this little animal in the corner here, and what's so special about a hydra that makes it extraordinarily challenging to kill?
You chop off its head, more heads.
Might grow back. Yes, not just one head grows back, but multiple heads grow back. So I think it may have been one of Hercules' labors, but anyway. So the hydra is something that was, once you could defeat this area of racial injustice in one area, cut off its head, but then other heads grow back. It's like, oh, if they figured that out, let's do this. You know, where if people are not obeying these, we'd rather you didn't segregate, that you didn't integrate schools, fine, we'll take our kids out of the school districts and we'll put them in private schools. Even though you are paying public taxes, your public taxes are partially going to go towards what we're doing, but they're not going to be used, for what your kids are doing if you're black. So what we have in the hydra is, in this time of Reconstruction and beyond, what a historian has called the nadir, the lowest point of race relations in the country. You had instances of racist propaganda where before enslavement, while enslavement was still legal, you would see in popular culture black people shown as happy-go-lucky. They're enjoying, they're gleeful, they're not very thoughtful, they're not intelligent, they're enjoying their state. But when freedom came along, they suddenly became this threat, and they became this, they're gonna come after, they're gonna want our jobs, they're gonna want our women, they're gonna want this. We have a sad, long history of that where a group of folks will be seen as one thing until the dominant population says, oh, this isn't gonna work for us. We need them to be, we need to demonize them so we can keep things the way they were since we don't have the legal enslavement over them. So racist propaganda was used in popular culture. Sharecropping, I always believe, should be spelled with a $sign because and there were black and white sharecroppers and probably other cultures as well, but you would share the crop with the owner of the crop. Unfortunately, you could easily get into debt because if you even were literate and you took your crop that you raised to the market, they could say, oh, you're only getting this much back, and since you borrowed money to get the seed and the tools and the machinery, then you're in debt to us now. Enslavement, you couldn't get in debt because you didn't own stuff, at least not that you were selling on the market usually, unless it was for your master or the one who owned you. But sharecropping was a devastating economic environment that many wished to escape, which they did. That was one of the reasons of the Great Migration we'll hear about. Racial violence occurred where you were killed. Folks were lynched, and that just means that you were killed, not just, but you were killed without due process. You didn't have your rights, you wouldn't get to face your accusers, and the crimes you could commit were something like, you walked on the sidewalk when I was on the sidewalk as a white person and you're black, so you've not followed the strictures and status quo we want, therefore we're going to kill you. Now, racial violence didn't tend to happen in areas that had a black majority. It didn't even happen when there was like half and half. There had to be usually about roughly a third black to 2/3 white was kind of the break. Otherwise, as you would imagine, there wouldn't be the numbers that folks could kill someone with impunity and not worry about, imprisonment, et cetera, or even a trial. Racial segregation, yes. Racial segregation, hit the wrong button, sorry, was when people were separate but equal, but they really were never equal. The Jim Crow laws, this was an issue of de facto segregation until it became legal with Plessy v. Ferguson, as I mentioned before. A friend of mine who's a historian did research on schools in Kansas, and he said that one of the letters that he found in his research was about education issues in Kansas, kind of at this time in the 20s and 30s. It said that the teachers were writing to the superintendent of the school saying, look, we know they're supposed to be segregated, but we can't keep these kids from playing together. I'm not trying to break the law, but what do you want me to do? So the kids were like, we're just hanging, we're going to be friends. But the kids were like, and that was these laws were in place to kind of try to make sure there was no miscegenation, no race mixing. It was with some very parochial and even ignorant views of race, which is really a social construction, not some biological absolute. But there are people to this day who act upon that for different reasons. And then the last one, disenfranchisement, is a big, big word for people kept from voting, as I mentioned, poll taxes, grandfather clause. If your grandfather didn't vote, you don't get to vote. Literacy test, you have to read the Constitution as a black person or black wannabe voter, but a white voter, they'd get basically like, see Tom run or whatever. So there were just ways to try to maintain that, that second-class citizenry status of black Americans in a large part. So this is what's happening. It's not a time of like black life elevation, black life agency where folks are they're being who they want and saying who they are. There is this is, like I said, the lowest point. This is when lynchings are at an all-time high, being murdered without due process, without any legal, structure. So what we have, there we go. We had black folks moving places. One of the first movements was the movement west. The Exodusters moved. There's folks that were living in the former Confederacy, these southern states, along, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, et cetera, South Carolina, Florida. And they would move in the 1870s and 80s, there were posters by Pap Singleton that said, go to Kansas, as well as but they went other places as well, but Kansas did get 6,000 arrived in Kansas the spring of 1879. Aaron Douglas's parents were in that group. Actually, they were probably in that group earlier. Well, because he was born in 99, so they were probably in that group. They came from Alabama, and they moved to Kansas. But then the Exodusters also moved to Montana, North and South Dakota, Colorado, Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, and Ohio. So these were places that there was this internal migration that occurred with black folks. And then another migration was the Great Migration. This occurred before and during the Harlem Renaissance, which, as I was, doing my research, and I knew this anyway, we go back in time to put periods on things. We might say something in the time we're in, but it's most often historians who look back and say, well, looking at these features, this is going to be the era of progressivism. This is going to be the era of this. This is the periods that we see with political things, artistic things, etc. The Great Migration occurred, and shows where out of the Deep South folks moved to. So Aaron Douglas's parents moved before he was born into Kansas from the South, but William Artis, his family, he moved with his family to Harlem from North Carolina. They moved up to North Carolina. It was his mother, his stepfather, who was named George Artis, and his brother. He took his stepfather's last name, but his brother didn't, which is, I didn't find out anything about why, but he chose to take his stepfather's last name. And then they moved north to Harlem. And so when he was 14. So both he and Douglas end up moving to Harlem, though Artis moves as a teenager with his family. Aaron Douglas moves there after he graduates from college. So, and some other things that happened to him life-wise. So African-American artists before Douglas and Artis included folks like Edmonia Lewis, Henry Oswald Tanner. Edmonia Lewis was part Native American, part black. When she and her brother, I think it was definitely a brother and maybe another child in the family, when the father left the family, the black father, the mother who was Native American and indigenous population, they moved to a reservation. She was known as Wildfire. And so she was known for she was interested in art. She attended a university and then studied over in Europe. Here's one of her pieces, Forever Free, and then which is showing a kind of stylized romantic version of a black man who has broken his chains. His wife is at his side on her knees, and we might look at that today with 2025 eyes and go, why has she got to be on her knees? Why can't they be side by side? Any ideas why Edmonia Lewis put those figures in that position? Any ideas? Well, you're right. They didn't have any political rights, as well as but yeah, you're on the definitely right track. Black men looked to white men on how women were treated. And the women were treated as to be, to think of it as Patricia Hill Collins, the scholar, says, it's a slippery slope from protecting to control. You know, you can go from protecting someone to you end up controlling them, and then that becomes a very negative thing. For some, protecting is a negative thing because it says you can't take care of yourself. But in this instance, black men really did not want their wives to work in the fields to make, when they were in the South anyway. And they were looking at, like you said, the time of what was gender in this time period was women should be on a pedestal. It should be the cult of true womanhood. Women stay at the home, they take care of the family, and the men go and work. Now, that really it was rarely, if ever, economically feasible for black families to do that. All white families couldn't do it. But this was why she portrayed the woman as kind of being sheltered by her husband as opposed to keeping her down, So it's hard to look at things out of time. That's why I wanted to kind of bring that up. The other piece that I have here, wow, these buttons are really little. The other piece is a symbol of Africa, the Cleopatra, the death of Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen, and then she died by putting the snake to her chest. But Cleopatra, other symbols of African-based women were seen as symbols of black folks. Henry Oswald Tanner, while he was in this country, he moved to Europe. Many black artists moved to Europe or moved away from the United States. This one, the banjo lesson, is an older man. I always think of him like teaching his grandson maybe the banjo. Resurrection of Lazarus showed some of his more biblical work. What he's using here is called a chiaroscuro, where it's a blend of two Italian words. Chiaro is light, oscuro is black or dark. And so you've got Lazarus in this light, and then there's Jesus, and then the other folks kind of are darker, so they kind of go with the background. And your focus is on, the resurrection of Lazarus, even more so than Christ. So this is what's happening with some black artists. These are two major artists of the time before Douglas and Artis come along. Okay, well, this is like when in my car, when I'm listening to something on my phone, it's like it stutters or something. Anyway, so I'm going to have to stop being so clicky. So what happened after this time period to try to get past the reality that black people were not succeeding or society was not allowing black people to be equal in social, economic, or political terms. So there were philosophers and leaders who looked to ways that could be overcome. One of those philosophical premises was the New Negro idea, or the New Negro by Du Bois and Alan Locke. One was Pan-Africanism, which is the movement to unite all people claiming membership of African or black race or African-descended folks. It assumes that the political unification of Africa will contribute to the welfare of all black people of African descent, no matter where they are in the world. The other, the New Negro movement, and I put these dates up of 1917 to 35. Honestly, I could find you like very highly esteemed scholars that say, no, it was 1919 to 1929. It was da-da-da to da-da-da. Some of it is tied to what artists and writers they wish to include, honestly. And so that's kind of where they're kind of timing it out. But the New Negro movement, these are the dates I picked. 1917 to 35. It was used to denote social and economic improvements since slavery, renewed racial pride, and political militancy, which kind of brings us to the movement, the organizations that brought this about. In 1908 was the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. 1909 was the National Urban League, and for all the folks that were migrated north, and they were in urban areas that were very, very different than the rural areas they'd come from. And then Marcus Garvey came from Jamaica. In 1910, he began UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So these were all organizations that were looking to bring about, this renewed racial pride, political militancy, social and economic improvements. They were kind of filtered through these organizations. The Negro, or the Harlem or Negro Renaissance, the goal there then was to achieve through the arts that Black Americans had been denied in the following realms: social, political, economic, and they wanted to use the arts. And the arts included visual art, which we're looking at today, but it also included writing. People oftentimes kind of leave out the visual arts for those who are, in the Renaissance, as they focus more on, say, Langston Hughes or Neil Hurston, John Toomer, Connie Cullen. But there are also, there were visual aspects, visual art aspects, which we'll talk about, as well as music, as well as dance. It's pretty much, there were artists, Black artists in all the forms. With the Negro in vogue, as it was said, cultural progress did seem possible to kind of achieve what had been denied in those socio-political economic realms. Only human beings can make art, and African-descended people in this country and beyond, but especially here in the United States with our very overt segregation, were really denied their humanity, their equality, to is being a human being. And so the Renaissance, arrived at the end of what was called the Great War, and it always kind of gets me when I realize we're looking back, I'm gonna guess that we're all in this room looking back on, we know of World War I and World War II. But if you were alive after World War I, it was called it was called the Great War. It was a world war. It was something that caused this upheaval, but we're not gonna do this again, and whoops, and then came along the war to end all wars. But then there was another one and another, but anyway, but the Great War, or World War I, optimism defined the mood of Black Americans, especially those men who had fought in the military. They were fighting for democracy at home and abroad. They were fighting for their country, and they came back and discovered that not only were they not treated as, heroes who, fought for freedom and democracy, men could be murdered by wearing their uniform. There are too many cases where a man is a person who served in the military, which my dad did much, much later, but just wearing your uniform would get people, they would say, "How dare you," and kill them. Whites would kill them. So again, in addition to this being an optimistic time, because we fought for our freedom, we fought for freedom for the world, so of course that includes us, said Black people, and we gave our lives and blood for this, but unfortunately, this also was a time of the second version of the KKK and their like-minded ilk. So the first version of the KKK, the Klan, was in right after the Civil War ended, 1866, in that area, 67. Now we're talking the 19-teens and 20s, where there was this panic at Black people having the nerve to want, freedom and equality and democracy. So Blacks mobilized and redefined themselves, or in other words, they were reborn. There was a renaissance, a rebirth. We're going to claim this self-definition of free folk who fight for democracy, who have earned, in any way you claim, you define it, our freedom. In Roman times, you didn't even get to fight in the military unless you were a citizen. You were a citizen soldier. And so from the longest times, if you fought, you deserved full citizenship. So, and all that goes with it. But the arts were kind of brought up because only human beings can make art. And there was this hope that with whites consuming the arts, as well as Black folks, but there would be an acknowledgement that would kind of help towards this equality that was desired. So that brings us to the first artist, Aaron Douglas. as I said, 1899 to 1979, the father of Black American art. He was a modernist artist. His artistic influences included African art, some Egyptian art from Northern Africa, but also Sub-Saharan Africa. So we'll see some masks and things from like farther down in the continent. Analytical Cubism, which was designed in part, well, no, totally designed, initiated by Pablo Picasso, Ruiz, and Marcel Duchamp, and, Georges Braque, sorry, and where they took 3 dimensions and put them on 2-dimensional planes of painting, of the paint and the canvas. Art Deco, a decorative movement, and then atmospheric effects and perspective. These are the artistic influences of his mature art. He's kind of, Douglas is a bit, I don't want to say schizophrenic in any way, this clinical man, but he came to Harlem in 1925, and he had been painting then in what they call the atelier style, where it's paint on a canvas and it's kind of showing, what you see, looking at some of the styles that were of the time, the modern art time. But then he studied with folks and was encouraged to look at Africa, to look at the continent and its art that Albert Barnes had in his collection, and to see what he could do to show Black art. So he famously wrote a letter that we'll see in just a second. So as I said, he graduated from high school in Topeka. He traveled east he was there at East St. Louis when they had race riots in 1917. He went to Detroit. While he was there, he worked as a busboy and also took classes at the Detroit Institute of Art. The farthest east he went was Dunkirk, New York, where he worked in a Essex glass factory with his friend from high school, Edward. That's what my play is about, is them going there, and some other things I made up. He graduated from UNL in 1922. He was the first Black art department graduate. He was called the, pun intended maybe, the golden boy, the fair-haired boy of the art department. He came to UNL without anything he really needed except the money to go to school. He had to get his high school transcripts. He had to find a place to live, and so I think he got a room in a boarding house. But he ended up, like I said, graduating as the first Black art department graduate, and then in 1926 he moved to Harlem after he'd been corresponding with Langston Hughes and reading about the new Black art and the new Negro movement. He read about those in magazines and journals such as Opportunity was the journal of the National Urban League, Crisis was the magazine or the journal of the NAACP, and he would eventually do illustrations for them. But the correspondence he had with Langston Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri. He was kind of raised in Lawrence, Kansas. As I said, Douglas, they're both Midwesterners, right? And they're both looking at what to do as Black artists. And so Douglas famously writes this letter to Hughes: "Your problem, dear Langston, my problem, no, our problem, is to conceive, develop, and establish an art era, not white art painted black. Let's bare our arms and plunge them deep into the very depths of the souls of our people. Then let's sing it, dance it, write it, paint it. Let's do the impossible. Let's create something transcendently material, mystically objective, earthy, spiritually earthy, dynamic." Well, if you know anything about transcendental or transcendence, they don't go with the material. I mean, he's using a turn of phrase here. He's using these kind of oxymorons to show just how impossible it will be, but also that it needs to be done. And we can do this amazing thing as artists and writers. So he moves to Harlem with his wife, Alta Sawyer Douglas, when they get married. She unfortunately passes away in 1959, I think in a car accident. He outlives her by 20 years, which I always found kind of sad. And she'd married somebody else before she married him. Anyway, that's in my play. The development of, because her family was really kind of upper to upper class, and his family was lower middle, lower class. And so I envisioned in my play that the parents didn't want them together because, she's here economically and he's here. Her brother, Alta's brother, was a diplomat in Washington, D.C., Eugene Sawyer. And so I'm sure it was, but they were like high school sweethearts, and they end up getting married and moving to Harlem. But the styles of the day, as I was talking about, the art styles of this time, the Paris folks like Picasso and Matisse, they're doing post-impressionism, Van Gogh, based largely on concepts and emotions rather than on a more objective reality. So they were interested in just capturing exactly what you see, but rather what emotions could come from that, what concepts did they want to share. And then also Cubism, as I mentioned, discarded spatial perspective for a more conceptual approach that regarded painting as a subjective rather than objective response to the world. It owes much to primitive art, expressionism, and structural relationships in painting. Picasso and Braque also looked at African art at Mass to see how to create these multi-dimensional kind of scenes that they wanted on a two-dimensional plane. So these are some of Douglas's inspirations. African art, as I mentioned, sub-Saharan and Egyptian, which had focus on the human figure, on sculpture, on performance art, and visual abstraction. Okay, I'm gonna do it. It's nothing too gruesome, I hope. Everybody stand up, because this is really, I think it's kind of interesting to think about. The Egyptian twisted perspective. Okay, so the Egyptians were very specific about what they wanted their art to look like, and they wanted it to showcase the human figure in ways that aren't realistic, so it was called a twisted perspective. So if you were gonna stand as if you were an Egyptian, like the song, you would put your feet one in front of the other, but they'd both be left feet, so the toe would be, or right feet, so the toe would be sticking out. You would turn so your waist was at its thinnest, but then you'd have to twist back and have while your waist is still thin, your chest is going front because you can see your shoulders better. And then when you turn your head, your nose is in profile, is more clearly a nose, but the eye was frontal. So if you can't physically, yeah, you're all like, eh, you can sit down. Okay, so, so that twisted perspective is what, is really kind of, is really incredibly forward. I mean, it's putting multiple time in space, if you think of it that way. So this was something that Douglas was inspired by. Also, we have the inspiration of, as I mentioned, the analytical cubism, reduce natural forms to their basic geometric parts, and then try to reconcile these 3D parts with the 2D picture plane. And then the other, Art Deco, is an art movement involved in a mix of modern decorative art styles, largely of the 20s and 30s. Art décoratif is what it kind of comes from. And the last thing that I have here is the atmospheric effects that Douglas put in his work. Think about driving or walking or being on a foggy day. You can see everything that's closest to you, really close to you clearly, but the farther away it gets dimmer and you can't see it. The colors don't contrast as much. There's less detail, and it gives you even more of a feeling of depth, Like as I'm looking through, like from me down to the exit out there, it's all very focused and very clear. But as a painter, or if I was drawing this or teaching drawing to a student, I would encourage them to use darker contrast closer and then lighter as it went back farther, so it would look even, if they want to emphasize that telescoping effect of the space, moving through space. So, and again, it's about a flat surface showing the illusion of space. So what I did is these are some things that Douglas designed for, like Opportunity, as I mentioned, is the magazine for the Urban League. These are illustrations that he did that show up in the New Negro, as well as other magazines. We've got, some of them illustrate poems that were in volumes, in magazines. Survey Graphic was one of the magazines of the day. And what things do we see here that kind of pop out to us? I like them. I used to just show them one-on-one, but now I really like them all together. So what do you see that kind of really shows you he is he's got a style? What do you see there? Maybe especially if you took out the Opportunity one, just because it's got some color, but what are the rest in? They're in black and white. They look like prints, but they're actually paintings he did with gouache, which is like an opaque watercolor. Any symbols that you see that you could identify or guess, if you're wrong, we'll just make you leave. It's okay. I'm joking. Oh my God, y'all were like, okay, dang, I got to get you stop joking. I'm about to be teaching in another month. There's a sun, and they have a sun. They have these beams coming down. Do we think it's just the sun? It could be, but what else could the sun stand for? And the light of maybe, like it could be in a heavenly light. It could be from another. He wasn't super religious, but he did the works. When you're illustrating, it's not about per se your personal beliefs as much as what you feel conveys what the illustration needs to be. But yeah, it's got this sun broken up. We've got this one. I just love this. See, it's better to say that than not. Okay, this one is. Goodness. Okay, yeah, here we've got like the trumpet blowing to these kind of figures that are kind of sad, and maybe I could do it this way. Maybe I'll stop. Maybe I'll just have some common sense. Like this one here. Yeah, that's the one. Where it's called "And the Stars Came Tumbling Down," which was a poem by Langston Hughes. But these are all like, they show his iconography. In other words, when images tell us something else. And then especially this one, I think, is really intriguing because sometimes people see in this corner here, they see it as a crown. Sometimes they see it as an eye. Sometimes they see it as the eye of God. So what's really amazing and interesting is you bring to art what you bring to it. You know, there's no law that says, nope, you're wrong. I mean, maybe if I was teaching art history and I told you something. But anyway, but if I left it up for your interpretation, you can enjoy it based on who you are and what you bring to the work. This cover that he did of the Bantu woman, this is from an image, probably, you know, obviously he's kind of an homage to this image of this woman with the headdress and kind of the extended face. And then here are some other illustrations. This one in the upper corner is for the Kriegwall players from Little Negro Theater in Harlem. He did a poster for them. So we see a lot of that African iconography or symbols that he's using, such as pyramids, sphinx, mask. He's using that kind of somewhat Egyptian twisted perspective. He's got the water kind of shown here very symbolically with the Nile, or with the wavy lines like the Nile probably, and then papyrus here. And then this is this is another poem illustration, but this fire cover, it was a book it was an edition that was hopefully gonna have more editions, but didn't. Douglas and Langston Hughes and, gosh, I wanna say Bruce Nugent, maybe I think Zora Neale Hurston, these were younger artists who put their money together to make this issue called Fire. Okay, you're not gonna believe me, you're gonna think I'm making it up. They sold okay. They were really trying to challenge that status quo or that respectability politics that maybe more middle and upper class folks had, black folks had. They wanted to really explore issues of gender, sexuality, along with race and economic class. But there are very few to hardly any like actual example or actual magazines of the fire issue left. You want to guess what happened to them? You'll never guess because I don't want to say obvious, but they caught on fire, really? Yeah, I'm like, what the what? You know, and I never ever found out if it was an arson thing that people were like, this is just too, you know, it's too racy for us to have out and about, or if it was just an accident, or, you know, but it's been reproduced. I mean, you can actually purchase, you know, not a real copy, but a reproduction of it for it's really reasonably priced if you want to see what was in it. Here are illustrations, the color illustrations around the outside, starting with fire and working your way around. These are all illustrations he did for James Weldon Johnson's book, God's Trombones, which was his name for the black preacher. And so you see things like Noah's Ark story, Simon the Cyrene holding the cross for Christ, who's down in that mandala below. I'm gonna make me a world where Adam is like God's hand is reaching down to Adam. And then you have the man in chains, and then you have Go Down Death. So these are all illustrations he did for that book that was published by Johnson, James Weldon Johnson, who also wrote the Negro National Anthem, he and his brother. And so he also did murals, which you can kind of see the similarities between those the illustrations, the book illustrations, the color ones, and then the paintings. The top 4 are his mural series, Aspects of Negro Life. And so the first one in this upper corner, do you notice this head looks kind of familiar, hopefully? It looks very similar to the profile of the woman who was in that cover for Opportunity. But this is, it was a mural that had 2 squares and 2 rectangles. This is, like I said, the Negro and African setting. This is Idol of the South. This is, from Slavery to Reconstruction. And I want to say this one is about industry. This one always reminds me of the famous Chaplin film, Modern Times, where the guy ends up getting sucked in the machine, which Chaplin did because he'd read about farm boys coming to the city and he couldn't keep up. Or that famous I Love Lucy episode where she and Ethel are trying to keep up with the chocolates. So it's like machinery is not always our friend. Some people would say about AI now, it's not really humane or human, but these are things that he did. These are just huge pieces. And in this upper, in the corner up here, what you see is families grieving. There's someone who's been hung, and then the feet. Over in this corner, you see the Klan. Here, these 2 buildings, historians believe these might be kind of emulating where he last taught at Fisk University in Nashville. You have this man either holding a book or a vote. It depends on who you read. But you have these layers that are very similar if you've ever seen any of the more ancient Assyrian or Egyptian, when they're telling a story, but it's almost kind of, I don't want to think just comic book, but when you're telling a story in a linear fashion like that, but also layers in a way too. And then this one below is one he did for Bennett College. It's one of the only 2 colleges left for black women, or that's a women's college focused on historically black college university. And this is Harriet Tubman. She's breaking chains above her head, to save her people. That's a mural he did. And then these are some of his paintings. So we see a big difference. Other than this first one, up here in the corner, about rise, shine, for their light has come. This one has elements clearly of his earlier paintings. But here we see these, what they're called atelier paintings. These are the paintings that look more like easel paintings. This one in the middle here is the window washer. That's in the Sheldon collection. This is his wife, Alta. And then these are both in Harlem. They're not dated. I think the Alta's the painting is 35. Or somewhere in there. He painted this window washer. It was in his alumni exhibit that when he went back for a reunion to Lincoln. And what's really so amazing to me is how this one and then the one that we have here at Museum of Nebraska Art, the figure is not looking at us. The figure has his back to us or has his head covered. And I think that's something to really think about as far as when the object of a painting is looking at you or even looking in your direction in a way like Alta's kind of looking kind of to the side of us, versus ones that look right in your eyes versus ones that you can't see their face at all. These are very things that are very evocative and think about when it's the figure. So here's the piece that the Museum of Nebraska Art has upstairs on exhibit, Untitled Seated Man with Head Resting in 1935. 35, Douglas was traveling through grants that he'd received. He started in the mid-30s teaching part-time at Fisk University in Nashville. He goes back permanently in 1940 to be there full-time till he retired in 66, I believe. And then, but this painting, again, it's showing us more of the face than the window washer is. But if you don't mind, if you just sit like that and see does it make you feel anyway that when you don't sit like that? And think about when you do have that kind of gesture, what might it mean? Any ideas on how you feel or how you felt when you did that? What is it? Weary? Yeah, it's like, yeah, anything, yeah. Huh? Woe is me, yeah. It's like either I've had a hard, long day, I was maybe out working, or it's but it feels like a body that's kind of, yeah.
I had students give that a name, little kids.
Uh-huh.
They were second graders, and he called it sad man.
Sad, yeah, because that is really a gesture of kind of, it's not looking at you, it's not standing up, you're not fighting gravity, you kind of just whoosh, It's kind of like how human bodies will go if if we aren't like working to keep ourselves more upright. And it's very, depending on if you have horrific posture like I do, you might find yourself more slumpy than you do, like standing with, like really upright, etc. So it's, but so it has a there's a wide range of interpretation. It could be he's very, very sad. He could just be a little tired. He might be just taking a little break or resting. He might be thinking about something. He could have fallen asleep like that. Trust me, I teach college. It happens. So, but just to like rest your hand in your hand, in your head in your hand, and just that connection of your body to, your brain, your head, like who you are. It's just really kind of amazing. And but it's still there's still some anonymity to it. It's not like with his wife, where we can see that it's who she is. He is showing, and there are many, drawings. He didn't always draw folks that you couldn't see who they were. And I don't think it's for any malicious reason or any bad reason. I think but it does give you, it's kind of more provocative. It makes you think, like, why would they be like that, in 1935? Or contemporarily if we were back then. It's oil on canvas, which is very standard. It is done, like we said, in an atelier style. It's very, very different from the pieces we saw here, So he did earn a grant, or received a grant to study in Paris at the Académie Scandinave, and then he went there, and then he also taught high school right after he graduated, and he really looked to kind of show the Black experience, and he really encouraged his students while he was at Fisk to be ambassadors of Black culture as they were in the world. So it's interesting. So some of you have already obviously seen this in person, which is always the way you should see work. I will tell you a quick story. I went once to, the first time I went to the Museum of Modern Art, and I was looking for the Giacomettis that I had shown in my art history classes, or art appreciation, one or the other. And I'm waiting for Giacomettis that, as you project it, they're bigger than life size. They were this big. Okay, so it makes a huge difference to see something in person. Like Dave Barry, the humorist, wrote years ago, no, where's the big Mona Lisa? Not this little thing, but where's the big one? Because when we see reproductions, especially in lecture, we think, oh, well, it must be, like, nope. So it's really important. The work is meant to be seen, unless it's some other kind of work. It's meant to be seen in real life with, so you can actually kind of see the distance and think about, like, where would you be as the artist? How far would you have to reach out, et cetera. So this is a quote. Aaron Douglas was a pioneer in American art. He was the first American to create works consistently and deeply rooted in African American and African culture and history, and his important place in history cannot be denied. That's from an amazing book if you ever want to know more about Aaron Douglas, Art, Race, and the Harlem Renaissance. Just an amazing book by a scholar who has since passed. Unfortunately, I got to meet her, and I have an autographed copy of the book, so when I read that she had passed, I was very sad. But Amy Kershke was the art historian who wrote that. So next is William Artis. Here he is, born in North Carolina, which had a lot of red clay, as a lot of places do in the South. He used to use red clay to sculpt. He would pick it up and it stuck together. He made art in the Boy Scouts when he was, when they would get together in their troop meetings. And he made a hand and took it to school, and everybody was like, oh my gosh. So he showed a lot of, I think, artistic skill early on. And as I mentioned, in the Great Migration, he moved in 27 with his mother, stepfather, and brother, and took his stepfather's last name. His artistic influences included both teachers he had and works that he liked. So the teachers he had, two influential teachers were Augustus Savage, who he learned from in Harlem, who had a school in Harlem, an art school, and then Ivan Mestrovich, who was one of his art professors in Syracuse, who went to, really? Stop it. Who went to Notre Dame. I never got to meet him. He was, okay, let me go back one. Well, it doesn't matter. Okay, I think I told you that Aaron Douglas was, he was the first black graduate in 1922. When I've shown some of his work to young kids, I sometimes will go, he and I went to the same university. They'd guess Creighton, they'd guess UNO, and then when they'd guess UNL, University of Nebraska Lincoln, did you know him? I'm like, wow. No, I wasn't quite old. And I'm like, yeah, we hung out all the time, yeah. Because they're not thinking, they just know I'm old, and this was 30 years ago. So I'm like, this was like, yeah, but they're like, did you know him? I'm like, no, not exactly. So anyway, but William Artis, he learned from Augustus Savage in Harlem, Mestrovich in Syracuse. Also, he really loved American indigenous art as well as African art. Plus, he was also encouraged to look at African art, just like Douglas was encouraged as well. These were some of these influences, the American indigenous art of the time that he would have seen, as well as the African art that was most likely in the Barnes collection that was really open for everybody. He also could have seen things in the Schomburg Center, but back then it was the 135th Street Public Library in New York. But I picked portraits because he's a portrait. I mean, the piece we're going to look at that's here is a portrait sculpture. But you see kind of some of the smoothness. You see, he doesn't always do just the frontal, and these are not in any way emblematic of this is the only kind of indigenous or African art you would see. But these are just, like I said, pieces I found that I thought were interesting and connected. But he really, I think he not only liked the aesthetic, the visual of the pieces, but also I feel like he connected to them philosophically. When you think about what the plight has been of the indigenous folks in this country, how the treatment of those folks, as well as, because he went to, as I'll tell you, Pine Ridge Reservation to teach. But then the African art, as I said, he was kind of encouraged to look to African art. He studied, as I said, with Augustus Savage. Here's two pieces by her. I did two different views of the Gammon, one of her famous pieces of a young, like a little newspaper boy, a little kid in the street, and then this young woman. And she's working here in bronze. And so like I said, we're seeing some of the influences, it's not like when artists have teachers, they don't have to do art just like them. If you are familiar at all with people like Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock, they couldn't look more different, but Benton was Pollock's teacher. But the art teacher, I don't think a good art instructor or whatever is ever going to be like, do it just like me, But I would hope not anyway. But you'll see sometimes there's some homage or emulation, and then sometimes it's like as different as Thomas Hart Benton doing his elongated figures, and then Jackson Pollock doing his splatter paintings. But then you hear how he did them, and you go, oh, okay, I guess I see how that connects. And then, so in 1933, when Artis was only 18 years old, he won the John Hope Prize and he got $100. That would be $2,500 today. So when I always like looking when I see some dollar figure, it's like, and so we don't go, well, that wasn't that much. I'm like, well, if somebody handed me $2,500 right now, woo, I would be dancing yeah. So anyway, so it was a really big award, And so he's getting this at 18, a very young age. This is Head of a Young Girl. This isn't the piece he won it for, but from what I researched, it said it's similar to this. So we see frontal, but notice what her eyes are doing. They're looking to the side. They're not looking straight ahead. And it's draped, it's kind of like similar to this draped head figure he would do. He also tended to he would sculpt portraits of his students when he's at the different places that he was an art instructor, but that won't come for a little bit. Artists through the 1930s exhibited in prime New York venues. So we're talking in his very early 20s. He's exhibiting in really great galleries and places. He was drafted in 1941, at Pearl Harbor, or not at, but because of U.S. entering World War II, which Europe and other places had already been in, and he served till 45. In the late 40s to the early 50s, he garnered national media attention and numerous art awards. So he really didn't, he was a very motivated artist, and he kept doing it even while he was serving. He was in Life magazine, July 22nd, 1946. This is Negro artists, their works win top U.S. awards. The piece by Artis is down here in the bottom. It's this woman with kind of longer, either a hair or a drape. But then there are other folks in here as well. Cordzier, Eldzier Corder, Marion Perkins, Richmond Barthé, Sergeant Johnson, and yeah, Artis's piece here is Draped Head, and then Head of a Boy by Eloise Bishop. So this was in Life magazine, and he is, again, he's barely, let's see, what year? It's like it's 46, so he's in his still his 30s, his early 30s. I mean, that's kind of amazing that he's getting truly national and international kind of acclaim. He then went to Syracuse in 1950, so he was like his mid to late 30s, 36, 37. He went to Syracuse to get his Bachelor of Fine Arts in 1950, his MFA in 1951, and then he studied with Ivan Mestrovich, as I mentioned. Douglas, as I said, he graduated in 1922 with his undergraduate degree. Then he got his Master's of Teaching from Columbia College, or Columbia's Teaching College. He got that, Douglas did, in 1940, and then he went to teach full-time at Fisk. So they both got a higher, they got education. They were both educated in the academy, as we would say, but at different times in their lives. Like I said, he taught at the Pine Ridge Reservation School. It was called something else in the early 50s. And then he moved to Chadron State College, but it was called Nebraska Teachers College back then, from 55 to 65. And then here's the video I wanted to show you. It's it's one of his students that's talking about like what kind of professor he was. So it's remembering him. Chadron did this in 2024. That's just on YouTube. You can, it's just you can watch it, you can watch it over and over again. So yeah, that was this, remembering William Artis. Here's the mural, some stills from the video showing him at work and then kind of looking at it. I just loved finding some of these pieces. This is mosaic in oil. It's 18 by 48 inches, so that's kind of this, but long. And just, I was really ecstatic to see all these pieces. And this is just a very little bit of all that's out there of him. And then here's a print that I think is actually featured in that video. And so it's a woodcut on tan Japan paper. You see again kind of those geometrics, and you can kind of see as it's in the 50s, so he's bringing together some of the influences he had, et cetera, in like African art and just kind of being with other artists. But here's the piece that he did, Head of Boy. This is from 1930, and you can see it's in terracotta, and you definitely see kind of maybe the influence of Augusta Savage in this, but very realistic, not at all like stereotypical or like very, very true to life kind of figuration. Here's another piece in the 50s. You can see this has got a little bit longer dimensions to it, but then the piece that you have up here at the here in Kearney at the Museum of Nebraska Art, the Vernon piece is terracotta, and I just think it's really gorgeous. And we can kind of see a little bit of that, not quite mannerism, but mannerism is a style where the figures get extended a little bit, but not to the point where they're like out of, realistic. They're still very realistic, but I think he's emphasized some pieces, and like I said, I strongly encourage you to see. And this is what was written about him when he passed away. It was written by Samela Lewis, who had founded a journal, Earth, Water, Fire, Air. From the dawn of his existence, man has used these elements to express his joys and sorrows and dreams. And so we understand why clay was William Artis's medium through which he expressed tenderness and hope. To the world of art, he left a rich legacy of sculpture and ceramics. And she wrote that in her journal, or that journal she started rather, Black Art and International Quarterly. So with that, thank you for your time. I totally forgot about the Q&A, so questions? I was looking at, and like, I was thinking, I'm gonna just, it's like, no, you gotta let people ask stuff. So, are there any questions? Yes.
Well, you mentioned back on Douglas that we had a painting. Do we have two of his?
I think you have 3. From what well, at least from on your website, I feel like I found 3. Maybe I can pull it up. Let's see. But did you have a question about one of them? Let's see.
When you said that we have one group,
Yep, you got the seated man, which if you click on, you'll see the larger version of. And then there is a house in Accra in Ghana. Oh, more than 3, yeah. So there's that piece, 55. It's in water. It's when he was teaching at Fisk, and this is in watercolor on paper. And then, but they may not all be on exhibit because you can't always show everything you have. But these are in your collection, because sometimes they get lent out because people are doing an exhibit. Here's Portrait of a Young Man that he did in charcoal on paper, and then the last one in the collection that's here, on here is, or no, not last one, the last 2. Untitled Man with Cap, he did with oil on board, but it's not dated. And then the last one is a red chalk and ink of himself, a self-portrait. So yeah, there are pieces here, but unfortunately, yeah, museums, you can't take up the whole, like, we show everything we have, and that's good because if you ever have art in your home, do you ever walk past it and forget you even have it? It's good to mix stuff up so you go, oh, that's right, so you see it differently with different eyes when it's in a different place. But I'm sorry, was your question how many
I was just surprised that we had more than one that's out.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Which college in Nashville did you say he taught at?
Excuse me, which college did Douglas? Yes. Fisk University. He taught at Fisk full-time in 1940 to when he retired in 66, after he went to Columbia Teachers College to get his master's. Any other questions? Yes.
Could you talk a little more why you think he was the father of Renaissance in terms of painting?
I think in part it's because, I think in some ways it's because he was so, I think in a way, so linked to and connected with Langston Hughes, who was considered like Harlem, the Shakespeare of Harlem. So they really, I think, talk so much about the aesthetics and the philosophy of what the new Negro philosophy was. He also was he read, before he moved to Harlem, he was reading the survey, or he was reading The Crisis, he was reading Opportunity, the magazines of the Urban League and NAACP. I think also he just really, he was always, his whole life, he was always like looking to teach himself things. And so I feel like, and also he did a lot of work. I think this is the main thing, in my opinion, maybe others probably say it, his work was in public in ways that you have to go to a museum, and that's great, and we want it to be protected, but you would see you could get a magazine and see his work. You could see he would paint murals for Harlem businesses. He would paint murals for like the library. So his work was out in the world, and I think that's really that kind of, that statement that's made and that kind of leadership that came from that. I think that's why he really got that title. Yeah.
I was wondering, because we were in Washington, D.C. last summer, at the National Portrait Gallery, there was a wonderful exhibit by William H. Johnson.
Oh yeah, he's amazing.
So
Yeah, and I think, and honestly, Douglas was rather a humble guy, I'm sure because I'm a Midwesterner, we don't brag. And so he never really kind of, I'm the father of blah, 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 but he kind of both got that kind of put on him, as well as he really took, I think he took advantage of, not in an opportunistic way, but in a very nurturing his art way. He applied for grants and got to travel and study, and then he would share that, he was able to keep it in the world, yeah. And he just did so many pieces that you could just see in your everyday life. You didn't have to Because some people are really scared of museums, which blows my mind. Like, they're going to yell at me if I go in there. And I mean, really? Well, not unless you touch something and you're acting kind of silly, but they want you to see the work. So yeah, I've had students who I've really had to kind of, I think they had some, maybe not the nicest art teachers who yelled at them or something. But I'm like, just don't throw anything, don't have any liquids, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, some people, like for me, museums are like the equivalent of a church. But for others, museums are, oh, I don't know if I can be in there, because they just, either they didn't get to go or they're just not, they don't feel comfortable. But hopefully, but I think, once they give it a chance, But his work you didn't have to go to a museum to see. You could see it out in the world, and so, which I would think would draw you into even seeing more of his stuff if you were drawn to it. Yeah, that's my best guess. You're welcome. Thanks for the question. Anything else? Anybody want to drive me back to Omaha? Fine, sheesh. You ask for a simple little favor, and where's the picture? Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.